So good morning, and I am extremely excited about this panel. The panel is entitled Media, Use, and Effects, and in the interest of time, since we are running a bit late, I won't go into great detail introducing, but just to say that this panel, I think, is going to be exciting, interesting. It's really taken the call. I think when we think about media and youth, we tend to focus a lot on the negative effects, whether it's of violence, whether it's of sexual content, whether it's of Facebook. And the people on this panel will talk some about effects, but they're also going to talk a lot about how youth are really positively engaging new technologies and media, and the sort of competencies that youth bring to this, and the potential for both new learning skills and ways of doing things. So I think it'll be interesting and engaging and in the spirit of the conference. So our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Craig Watkins. He is in the Department of Radio, TV, and Film at the University of Texas, Austin. He studies young people's social and digital media behaviors. He has written a book entitled The Young and the Digital: What the Migration to Social Network Sites, Games, and Anytime, Anywhere Media Means for Our Future, and explores young people's dynamic engagement with social media. He's also interested in the digital divide and is part of the MacArthur Foundation's research network on connected learning. His talk today is entitled Closing Digital Divides and Increasing Digital Literacy.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here over the last 2 days. And just really quick background. So I'm a sociologist by training, and so I spend a lot of my time and a lot of my research is really about trying to immerse myself in what I call the digital trenches, and that is trying to get kind of as close as I possibly can to young people and learning about their migration to the digital world. So we spend a lot of time talking with young people, one-on-one interviews, focus groups. We do a lot of observational work in the home, kind of virtual things online in terms of how they're using various kinds of new media technologies. And more recently, we've also started getting into schools as well. And I'm currently in 2 high school classrooms working on a project that I want to mention today as well. So a lot of what I want to talk about today is just sort of sharing with you some of the things that we're learning about young people's sort of deep immersion into the digital world, and questions also that we're raising along the way. So I'm going to basically sort of build this talk around what I consider kind of 4 kind of crucial shifts in terms of my own work, and in terms of the kinds of changes and transformations that are informing and hopefully kind of nuancing the ways in which I think about young people's engagement in digital media, their embrace, if you will, of digital media. So the first one might be kind of this shift from what we historically have thought about as the digital divide to how we now might think about participation gaps. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but historically, the sort of digital divide narrative, right, we're all fairly familiar with. It is this narrative of the technology rich and the technology poor. And it has typically sort of define the problems and the challenges that we all face, but certainly the sort of disadvantaged face in terms of access to technology, access to computers, access to the internet, access to those kinds of opportunities that sort of drive our information-based economy and our technology-rich world. And while those issues currently still resonate, and they certainly still matter in sort of respected parts of the population and certainly around the world, a lot of researchers like myself are beginning to kind of shift our critical glance more to looking at issues of kind of participation and what we characterize as a participation gap. So Henry Jenkins, for example, wrote a very important paper that was part of the MacArthur Foundation Initiative on Youth, Digital Media, and Learning a few years ago, sort of looking at this issue of participation gap. And this is a reference to the degree to which young people are developing the skills and the competencies and the kind of expertise to make very important sort of strategic and sort of empowering decisions in terms of how they're using digital media. And so one of the questions that we're beginning to raise in our work and sort of thinking about in our work is to what extent are the skills and the competencies that we identify as important to enabling young people to have a much more empowered sort of digital media experience, to what degree are those skills and competencies distributed in an even type of manner, in an even type of way. And so this is the notion, right, that we're less concerned about access and more about the quality of engagement, more about participation, more interested in the kinds of skills and expertise that people bring to their, again, their use and their participation in technology. So here's a quick data point, any number that I could have shared with you, or from the Kaiser Family Foundation. So if you followed the work that they've done on youth and media since 1999, there have been 3 major reports where they've surveyed over 2,300 young people around the country, ages 8 to 18. Over the years, they have sort of tracked, right, young people's deeper and deeper kind of engagement in media, and sort of thinking about all kinds of media, traditional forms of media, print media, books, music media, television, video games, and obviously, right, more computer-based interactive types of technologies and media that have become such a pronounced part of their everyday environment. But I wanted to share this slide with you because I think it sort of sets up part of the story that I'd like to share with you today, and that is the extent to which the media ecology, the media landscape or the media environment of young people is changing in some quite striking and profound ways. So what you see here, right, is the degree to which young people on an average day are exposed to different kinds of media. Amongst Black and Latino youth, you see about 13 hours a day of some type of media exposure. And I know you ask yourself, how in the world do you get to 12 or 13 hours a day of media exposure? But when you factor in, right, the kind of multimedia, kind of multitasking behaviors that have become quite common in young people's lives, you begin to easily see how they reach and in some cases even surpass those numbers. So that means that they're, even as they're online Facebooking, right, maybe they're listening to music, maybe the TV is on, maybe they're texting, maybe they're playing a mobile game. So they're doing multiple things simultaneously, and this is how you begin to reach these types of numbers. But for me, what's really one of the more striking sort of data points that we share from this report is the amount of time that young people are now spending online. And historically, I think up until around 06, 07, 08, we still pretty much, our perspectives are pretty much still shaped by this concern about access to technology, right? The sort of digital rich and digital poor. And what we begin to see from Kaiser, we also see this from the Pew Internet and American Life Project, you see it from Nielsen, we've seen it in some of the research that we've been doing, that narrative has shifted in some important ways that we now need to be able to acknowledge and also address in terms of how we think about issues of technology, how we think about issues of equity, and the impact that it has in young people's lives. And specifically what I'm referring to here is the degree to which young African Americans and Latinos, for example, are now beginning to spend just as much, if not more time online than their white and middle class counterparts. And this, again, it kind of cuts against the grain of what we typically had thought that we've known over the years and suggests that we have reached another point, another era in a relatively short history and span of digital media. Second shift is one that we're all familiar with. If you live with a teen, if you see teens, if you're around teens, if you work with teens, the increasing sort of presence of mobile technologies in their lives. And I sort of argue, right, based on a lot of the work that we do and some of the observational techniques that we employ, that mobile really has become kind of the hub of young people's identities, the hubs of their lives. Virtually everything now, right, is connected to their relationship to mobile technologies, the social networks, the manner in which they communicate, the degree to which they communicate, the information that they access, the entertainment that they consume. It is all now, in many respects, sort of routed through mobile technologies. And what I find particularly interesting about this is another data point from Kaiser, is the extent to which younger and younger children are now owning their own mobile devices. And so you see here, just between 2009 and 2004, the growth in terms of ownership of iPods, the growth in terms of ownerships of laptops, but perhaps most importantly, right, the growth in terms of ownership of mobile devices, mobile phones in particular. So the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which has been tracking a lot of these trends over the last few years or so, I think in 2004 they reported that roughly 40% of teens between the ages of 12 and 17 owned a mobile phone. Today, that's more like 75% and continues to grow. We also know that younger and younger children are now becoming owners of mobile technologies. Again, iPods, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds are now owning mobile phones. And so it suggests, right, that many of the issues that we thought once sort of tipped during adolescence are now really beginning to emerge amongst younger and younger children. So it's raising all kinds of challenges, but it's also raising, I want to suggest, all kinds of opportunities too, in terms of how we understand young people's migration and their sort of steady and deep immersion in the digital media world. There's also something that we've noticed in a lot of the research that we've been doing, and I've characterized it kind of as the mobile paradox. And what do I mean by that? So a lot of times when we're sitting and we're meeting and we're talking with young people individually or in focus groups, it's not uncommon for them to have their mobile devices with them. And we oftentimes take pictures of them. We'll ask them to take their devices out, show us what they're using. And really, we don't have to ask them to take their devices out because they're already out and they're already using them. And that's okay because we ask them not to change who they are for us, right? We want to sort of to understand them and observe them in ways that are sort of natural as it can possibly be when we're sitting there talking with them and observing them. But one of the things that we found quite striking a few years ago was a recurring theme in terms of amongst Black and Latino youth, right? The degree to which they were using mobile phones, right? And this has also been supported by the Kaiser Family Foundation, again by Nielsen, again if you look at the Pew and Internet American Life Project, and that is the degree to which the mobile has become the alternative gateway point, if you will, to the online world. So we know, for example, that Black and Latino youth are more likely than white youth, for example, or Asian youth, for example, to use their mobile devices to play games, to use their mobile devices to social network, to use their mobile devices to listen to music, to use their mobile devices to watch video, right? There's a much more kind of wider, sort of robust use of mobile technology amongst Black and Latino youth that we're now really just beginning to understand. And in the press, as they have begun to sort of understand these trends and to sort of identify them, one of the sort of headlines has been, is mobile closing the digital divide, right? Now that mobile has become the kind of alternative gateway, does this suggest that a lot of the concerns and anxieties that we had about this equity gap in terms of technology, is mobile sort of the solution? And I argue that it depends on how you define the divide. If you define it primarily as an issue of access, then you could perhaps make a case that it is. But if you define it in terms of quality of participation, if you define it in terms of skills attainment and development, then I think the issue is a lot muddier and much more complex. But the paradox here, right, is that these youth are oftentimes more likely to grow up in households without access to broadband. And we know, right, that households that have access to broadband, the range of things that they do online are much broader. But more importantly, these households are also more likely to create, share, and produce content. And we see that, right, as an important measure, as an important outcome, as a critical outcome in terms of digital participation, in terms of the kinds of digital media practices that young people are engaging in. So the question then emerges, are all digital media ecologies equal, right? So even as there's a growing diversity of young people migrating to the online world, owning mobile devices, going online, doing all of the kinds of things that we're identifying and suggesting, does that suggest, right, that the outcomes are equal? And particularly the sort of learning outcomes that we're interested in and understanding. A lot of the work that the MacArthur Foundation has been supporting is really trying to think about the kinds of informal ways and the kinds of informal learning ecologies that kids are creating outside of more formal kind of adult mediated kinds of spaces. So this idea, right, that kids have, much of what we talk about in terms of what kids do with technology, a lot of it, right, they have learned sort of from peers. They've learned from each other. They've learned outside of the school. They've learned outside of the formal sort of instructional environment. That's beginning to change to some degree, but historically that has certainly been the case. I just got a reminder that my time is running out and 15 minutes goes by so fast. But one of the projects that we're working on is supported by the MacArthur Foundation, is a research network called Connected Learning. And this is an attempt to try to understand the ways in which learning happens across multiple kinds of spaces that kids inhabit on any given day. School, but also the informal peer ecology, home, the online environment, and really trying to think about, from our perspective, the ways in which learning happens, the ways in kids sort of navigate these different kinds of environments, and the degree to which they are potentially sort of connected. Just to give you one example, in the school that we're in, in the classroom that we're in, we see a lot of kids in this one particular class that we're in, and it's because of the teacher and because of the kind of supportive environment that he's created, these kids are able to bring many of the kinds of skills that they develop with technology informally at home and in their peer networks into the classroom. And we see that, right, as a sort of interesting sort of example of what we mean by sort of connected learning and how kids are beginning to weave really sort of interesting pathways, if you will, to more enriched, more engaged, more different, I would argue more distinct kinds of expertise in terms of how they're using technology. But what we want to try to understand in the qualitative work that we're doing and in the case studies that we're doing where we're visiting homes and meeting parents and talking to kids and trying to get a sense of the broader kind of social world and social ecology in which they're immersed in is to what degree do these things play out in different ways across all of these different kinds of variables and indicators, social indicators, race and ethnicity, class, geography, gender, a number of things, parental education. We know that there's an association between parental education and the types of media that kids use, the type of media they're exposed to, the amount of time that they spend with media. And so issues of class and cultural capital are very important in terms of what we're trying to understand. So I'm going to speed through this really quick. This was a really interesting study that I came across earlier this year by Latitude, which is a sort of global research organization that does a lot of research in terms of just the kind of information culture and space that we live in. But they ask very young children, I think between the ages of about 4 to 11, what would you like the internet to be able to do for you that it currently can't do for you? And rather than have them answer the question, they had kids draw pictures, right, of what they would imagine the internet being able to do in the not so distant future. And he ended up identifying a number of different sort of trends and sort of modes of thought and kind of dispositions in terms of what kids were articulating via these pictures. And one of them, right, was the extent to which kids began to make begin to start blurring the lines between the virtual and the physical world. So this one young girl, for example, she'd like for her computer to convert images of food and make them real. I'd have to admit that I'd like that to happen too. This other young girl from Colombia, I'd like to go through the computer to places that are inside it. So how they were kind of reimagining the potential relationship between the world that they inhabit, the sort of instinctive sort of world that has become sort of known to them, the only world that they've known, this sort of online, sort of digital virtual world, but also this relationship to the physical world. But what I was most sort of intrigued by, right, were the group of kids who drew pictures like these. And this one young male from the United States indicated that I wanted to make my own video games. And it represents what I think is a really important sort of a third shift that I wanted to identify here, and that is the sort of dispositional shift. Right, this idea that kids are beginning to develop a very different kind of orientation towards technology. So rather than simply being interested in sort of okay with and satisfied with consuming the massive amounts of information that are available online, they are now increasingly interested in creating and producing and making their own content. And we see that, right, as a very sort of a powerful opportunity to engage them in more relevant, more authentic, more meaningful kinds of ways. And so this is what you oftentimes see, sort of the conflict and the tension in the classroom, kids walking into the classroom with a very different disposition of what it means to be a learner, what it means to be a producer, what it means to be a thinker, that in some ways come into conflict with the types of environments and the kinds of identities that they are oftentimes acquired in more traditional modes of instruction. And this is this idea, right, that we have 21st century kids walking into 20th century classrooms, and how do we begin to remodel our classrooms and rethink learning in ways that are more consistent with the kinds of active and dynamic forms of learning that are happening in these kinds of informal spaces. And we see that as a very important opportunity. So I know I'm out of time here, but another project that we're working on in the same high school, we're in 2 classrooms, game development classes. And my idea, right, is to sort of think about using game design, right, as a mode of kind of critical civic engagement. So these kids are doing research, they're doing a sort of data collection, a lot of brainstorming and thinking around issues of childhood obesity, which have sort of introduced them to thinking about concepts of food, food desert, food equity, food justice, which are all sort of connected, right, to issues of race and ethnicity, issues of class, issues of geography, and how issues of power play out in their everyday lives. So to sit with students, right, at a table and to sort of take them through a kind of design thinking process where they're beginning to articulate these ideas and identifying them and collecting data around them is really sort of interesting and striking to see. And we take them through this sort of iterative process called the design literacy that I don't have any time to talk about now, but maybe I will in the question and answer. But we see kids sort of moving through what we call kind of hybrid learner identities, where rather than simply coming into the classroom and being consumers of information, right? Sort of passive information, it's the information that teachers pass on to them and expect students to get back to them. This idea, right, that kids could perhaps play very different kinds of roles, very different sort of roles in the classroom. So we see them, right, sort of taking their mobile devices, and we ask them to go out and use their mobile devices to capture data. We ask them, for example, when we go out into the field and do research and collect data, sort of they take on the identity of researcher. They take on the identity of storytellers. They storyboard, they write, they concept, they're sketching, and they're visualizing their ideas as they're sharing and brainstorming in ways that we think are really quite striking and different from what they're typically asked to do and expected to do in the classroom. They're artists. These kids are bringing all kinds of skills and interests and passions into this classroom that we think are very important. They're collaborators, and then finally, they're problem solvers, and we see that, right, as a very important and critical skill for many reasons that have been articulated. And finally, sort of the fourth shift that I wanted to just mention is there is this sort of profound demographic shift that's taking place in the United States today. And I've been paying a lot of attention to the 2010 census, and in particular looking at what's happening with the 18-year-old and younger population in this country. And if you follow that data, what you see, right, is a young America that's becoming increasingly and profoundly racially and ethnically diverse in a way that is quite historic. And this is just one sort of representation of that from the census. And this is the percentage of infants under the age 1 who are not white. And what you see, right, is that there's a growing trend around the country where in 10 states now, and in 35 major metropolitan areas, white children are now sort of the minority in those respective places. And what we see, right, in terms of the growth of the youth population, the 5-year and younger population, an increasing presence of Latinos, Asian Americans, multiracials, and in certain parts of the country, African Americans. And I think this has profound impacts in terms of how we think about the future of learning, the profound impact in terms of how we think about who those future learners will be, and why digital literacy is so important. And so from my perspective, and this is a classroom, I visit a lot of classrooms, this is one in the Bronx, where about 95, 98% of the students in this kindergarten classroom come from households where Spanish is the only language spoken. And so my point here, right, is that how we think about young people, how we define young people, and how we understand young people must take into consideration these profound demographic transitions that are happening, and that finally, digital equity is really about digital literacy. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Craig. Our next speaker is Dr. Brian Mustanski. He's an associate professor at Northwestern University in the Department of Medical Social Sciences, and he directs the Impact LGBT Health and Development Program. His work's been funded by NIH, the National Science Foundation, and he's also a William T. Grant Foundation scholar. His work focuses on the health and development of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth. His title of the talk today is LGBT Youth, Technology, and Health.
Good, and it looks like the technology is working, so that's a good thing when you're talking about technology. One of the things I was thinking about from the discussion yesterday, I felt like there was a question that was emerging as the topic of technology was bubbling up a little bit, which is all this new technology a repackaging of old issues, or is it a paradigm shift in the lives of young people? And I think the answer to that question is yes. It's both of those things, and I hope that I'll actually be able to convince you that that's the case during my brief 15-minute presentation. I use the abbreviation LGBT to stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth, which are the minority population that my work focuses on. And in some ways, I argue that this population is somewhat like the tech canaries. In many ways, they're early adopters, and their transgressive use of technology really forecast patterns of healthy and unhealthy youth by heterosexual youth. And what the youth are eventually doing with technology, us adults eventually stumble upon and try to pick up over time. And so I think even if you're not necessarily a scholar who focuses on LGBT youth, you may be interested in this population from a technology standpoint because I think they're early adopters. And I'll give a couple examples of that. So in 1998, which was a very, very long time ago in the history of the internet, there was an online study, convenience sample, but very large, of LGBT youth. Now when this study was released, it had a profound impact on my research career because it was probably the first time ever that there had been a study published that had nearly 7,000 LGBT teens included in the sample. Now you could gripe about the sampling methodology and how representative it was, certainly, but nevertheless it was an opportunity to study this population during their emergence and during their teen years when they were really grappling with the development of their sexuality. And that wasn't really something that was available to us prior to the advent of the internet. What they found in that study was that the majority, greater than 50% of these youth, said that they came out online before they did so in the real world. So came out means that they told someone that they identified as LGBT over the internet before they told someone in their real life. And so for me, what I took away with this from this study was that it was a profound approach that we could use to reach these kids before, or sort of earlier than we had before. Prior studies of LGBT community often started in the 20s at the earliest. We thought that's when sort of people came out. And it certainly is a hard endeavor to identify a population that hasn't identified themselves. So using the internet was a really important way to begin doing research with LGBT adolescents. This is some data. Actually, I'm comparing some data from the Pew Internet Study, which is a large random digit dial survey of teens in the United States, 16 and 17-year-olds, asking questions about have you used the internet to find general health information. And what you'll see in the orange is the kids from the Pew survey, and what you'll see in the blue is the kids from my survey of LGBT adolescents. Again, we could gripe with sampling differences and comparisons between studies. Obviously, that's problematic. But nevertheless, you actually see some pretty dramatic differences between the LGBT teens' use of the internet to find health information. 60% of them endorse that behavior, whereas 30% of the general population sample of youth. When you ask, have you used the internet to find sensitive health information, the number is actually quite low amongst the general sample of youth. Less than 20% of them say that they've used the internet to find sensitive health information, however you might define that. We didn't ask that exact same question, but we did ask, have you used the internet to find information about HIV/AIDS? And nearly 60% of our LGBT youth say that they've used the internet to find HIV/AIDS information. And almost 70% of them said that they've used the internet to find LGBT information. Now, we need to do sexual health research with LGBT youth for a number of reasons. One is that certainly they experience a number of sexual health disparities. In terms of HIV/AIDS, if you look at the pie chart on the right, you'll see that young gay and bisexual men represent 60% of HIV infections amongst all adolescents. I'm talking about both male and female adolescents. They have about 35 times the rate of HIV as their heterosexual peers. In fact, there's data suggesting that almost 1 in 5 young gay and bisexual men is HIV positive. This is a huge epidemic that needs to be addressed, a huge sexual health epidemic that has to be addressed. And technology is one means that we may have to reach these young men. Also, LGBT youth certainly face obstacles in terms of achieving sexual health, self-acceptance, connecting with their families and peers, developing healthy romantic relationships. I consider sexual self-acceptance and having healthy romantic relationships to be core parts of achieving sexual health and well-being. We find some data that young gay and bisexual men in particular are using the internet as a means to meet sexual partners. And if you think about your average high school, you know, there's not necessarily going to be a lot of other out young gay men in a high school. And so your options for dating could be quite limited. If there's 2 out gay youth, you could choose to date each other, or you could choose to find other means to meet people for romantic relationships. And the internet is a major way that people are using to turn to. Some of our data from Chicago showed that nearly 50% of the young, MSM stands for men who have sex with men, so you could, technically that's probably very similar to gay and bisexual young men, use the internet to meet someone to have sex with. But there were very significant differences by race. And we see these racial differences in a lot of our work on sexual health and the internet. The black youth had nearly a 90% lower odds of using the internet for that approach. And the Hispanic youth had 50% the odds, although that difference wasn't significant in the sample. So the internet is certainly a way in which people are using as a means to meet sexual and romantic partners, which really leads us to the question of, does how you meet your partner influence your sexual risk behavior? And this is a question that's received actually a lot of attention in the HIV behavioral literature, also a lot of information or a lot of discussion in the popular media. And when I approach this question, I really use kind of a setting level research approach. I think of the internet as a setting, just like you might think of a classroom as a setting or a community center as a setting. And when you're studying settings, one of the really methodological, rigorous ways to study settings is to study kids, the same kids in different settings. It gives you a window into how settings influence kids. And so I use the same approach when I study the internet. And in terms of addressing this question, as I mentioned, there was a lot of research and media stuff suggesting that the internet is a risk environment. There's been studies that showed syphilis outbreaks that were through internet chat rooms where one person with syphilis went into a chat room to meet sexual partners, and it spread through the chat room, not obviously electronically, but through offline meetings. And you know, there's been this idea put forward that it's a risky setting. But again, I think the best way to study settings is to study the same person as they move through different settings. And so I'm going to show you a little data from Project Q2, which is a longitudinal study of LGBT youth that we've been doing in Chicago. Just last week, we started our 40-month follow-up. So it's a fairly long-running longitudinal study. We've had very good retention. We have 91% retention at 1 year, which is some of the longitudinal data that I'm going to show. And what we did in this particular study is that each time that the kids came in for their interview, we asked them about their 3 most recent sexual relationships. So if you sum across these different waves of data collection, if you take their baseline data where they reported on 3 most recent relationships in the last 6 months, you add the 6-month follow-up where again they report on their 3 most recent relationships over the last 6 months, and you look across the year, you have data on up to 9 partners that they've had over an 18-month window. And what we can do is we can actually compare across these different partners and how they met those partners to get a sense of how they've behaved when they met that partner through the internet or how they've behaved when they met that partner through another means. And we use these mixed effects, hierarchical linear modeling approaches to account for the clustering of partnerships within person. On average, the young men, this is now just focused just on the young men in the sample, had 5.7 episodes of unprotected sex in each of the partnerships that they reported. And what's interesting is then is the question, how many of these different types of partnerships have they had that they would consider to be a serious relationship? There's some interesting evidence in studying adolescent romantic relationships that there's this pattern of serial monogamy in adolescence. They date somebody, have one serious relationship. Obviously, I wouldn't do the air quotes in front of the young people. But one serious relationship, then 2 months later, they have another serious relationship. And so in this sample, 20% had no serious relationships in 18 months. 23% had 1 serious relationship. 23 had 3. 6% had 4 serious relationships in an 18-month period. And what I'm going to show you here is the effects of whether they met that partner online or whether they met that partner offline. And unless you have a microscope looking at the top of those lines, you're really going to see that there's essentially no difference. When people met their partner online, they were no more risky in terms of their sexual behavior than when they met their partner through another means. And about 25% of the partners were met online. Now you throw in the relationship question. And what you see is that almost all of the unprotected sex, almost all of the risky sex, is occurring in the context of serious relationships. These young men very rarely have unprotected sex when they're having sex with somebody they consider to be casual. And so what we see is, even in the context of this technology paradigm of studying people and their behaviors and the role of the internet, we come back to these old ideas, these very important ideas that relationships matter and romantic relationships are really important to young people. So that leads me to the question of, do LGBT youth want to hear about healthy relationships online? If we're doing an online education campaign, would they like to hear about healthy relationships? Because my philosophy is the best interventions are ones that both are evidence-informed, but that people actually want to receive. And so we asked young people, if we did an online intervention, what would you like to hear about in this online intervention? And what we see is actually, of the top, we asked them 20 different topics. Many of the top 10 things have to do with romantic relationships. Number 1, keeping a long-term relationship. Number 2, building a healthy relationship. They're much more interested in hearing about relationships than they are about condom use and HIV. And I think that turns back to that discussion we had this morning about positive youth development, that we can reach young people by talking about having healthy relationships and incorporating sexual health into those discussions of healthy relationships. And if you think about young people, they spend most of their time thinking who they're going to date, when they're going to see that person, if that breaks up, who they're going to date next. And LGBT teens are no different. So one way that we've focused on delivering some of this information about relationships is through our Impact Program website, which has been funded by the WT Grant Foundation to develop these materials. And we try to use this as a forum for us to deliver information about healthy relationships, and that's informed by our research. So if we have one publication come out, we make a YouTube video about that topic to inform young people about our findings, since they're the ones who helped us generate the data. And I'm going to show you actually a clip of one of those videos. We're in the process of evaluating the Impact Program website. We did another evaluation of a project called Keep It Up, which was funded by NIMH, an online intervention, which actually reduced the rate of unprotected sex in half at a 3-month follow-up, which is actually larger than what many offline interventions have found. So we're really triangulating on this idea that relationships are a key way for us to reach young people and convey sexual health information. And because I think one of the most powerful ways to think about this is to actually hear from young people. I want to show you a video that we just completed very recently with some documentary filmmakers in Chicago, conveying information about healthy romantic relationships, answering questions like, how do you meet a partner? How do you keep your relationship happy? How do you bring up topics like condom use and sexual health within a relationship? And our work is really informed by the IMB model of health behavior change. So we think about things like motivation and behavioral skills. So let's roll the video. Oh, that's not the video.
What I love about my sexuality.
What I heard about my sexuality.
I heard my sexuality.
What I love about my sexuality is that
We met in high school.
So we met online.
Mark had a great smile and a great personality.
I saw her at her birthday party and I was like, I want that.
I always
think
thought
the audio's
that
not matching the
talking
video,
about
so
safe
just be aware
sex
of
was
that.
just like the worst thing in the world. Like, how could you possibly say that to someone and bring that up and ruin the moment? But if you don't, no one's going to protect you. You have to protect yourself.
When Tanya brought it up, I kind of felt like, empowered. I felt like she respected me a lot. And she wanted to practice safe sex because of that.
Our safe sex relationship kind of also included, going to sex stores together, never being offended if someone says, I don't want to ever try that with you. And it's not about that person, it's about themselves. So,
and that's
that was
part of
important to us.
safe sex is having comfortable
I
sex.
didn't know anything about how women have sex and stuff. She let me.
She didn't hide any of her past, which I really appreciated. And we didn't hide each other's, uncomfortable, but also crossed history. And that made me feel safe.
It was assumed that we would be monogamous, which is an extremely dangerous assumption.
I think we kind of spelled it out, though, too, pretty clear that what did we mean by boyfriend.
And I think you need to do that because everyone's definition of that might be different.
We're very jealous. That's one thing that we always gotta overcome.
Something that I like to do is really try to establish a safe space whenever we're gonna have a conversation. Even in the passionate moment, I try to stop. I just go let's stop, just to stop talking. Let's breathe.
And then whenever that happens, we try to talk, but it doesn't.
In the interest of time, do you want to just go ahead and skip over it? Anyone's welcome to actually go to the impactprogram.org website and watch the video. In the real video, the voices and the images actually line up with each other, which is a really innovative approach to doing video. But anyway, you could see that within that video, we hear from young people talking about things like, how do we keep our relationship happy? But also embedded in that, we have things like, how did you bring up safe sex with your partner? We've gotten a really positive response from that video. And we have a whole package of other videos about how to use a condom correctly, about HIV and how it's transmitted, other aspects of sexual health, and different games on our website. And again, we're starting an evaluation of that shortly. So thank you for your attention, and it's really been a pleasure to be here at this conference.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So our next speaker is Peggy Orenstein. She's an internationally acclaimed writer and speaker on issues affecting the lives of girls and women. You may recognize her two New York Times bestseller books, Cinderella Ate My Daughter, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the New Girly Girl Culture, and the memoir Waiting for Daisy. She's also the author of a book that I know had a great impact on a number of us in this room, Schoolgirls, Young Women's Self-Esteem, and the Confidence Gap. Her writing appears in the New York Times Magazine, Ms., the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, the New Yorker, it could go on and on. The title of her talk today is called From Princesses to Pop-Tarts, the Impact of the Girly Girl Culture on and Offline.
Hi, so I'm going to speed talk. I'm going to get to the online new media, social networking stuff, but first I just want to talk a little bit about the general media bombardment that girls in particular are subject to. My work these days has been largely about the persistent and increasing sexualization of girlhood. Oh, look what's up there already. And the ways that despite all the strides that girls have made on the playing field, in the classroom, in college admissions, that the pressure to define themselves through how they look, to make how they look who they are, has not abated one whit, and that in fact it's skewing younger, so that the culture repeatedly tells girls that their primary value comes from being hot, that they should judge their bodies by not by how those bodies feel, but how they believe they appear to others. And that, and in fact, I just don't know if you guys have seen, but Occupy Wall Street, the new blog they have, Hot Chicks of Occupy Wall Street. Yeah. And that sexualization, and there you have it right there, even in the, in that kind of realm, puts girls at risk psychologically and physically for the pitfalls that we worry about with them, for distorted body image, eating disorders, depression, unhealthy sexual choices. And listening to all of you over the last couple of days, it's occurred to me how relevant this idea of understanding sexualization is, because it's really an obstacle to a lot of what we're talking about. It's an obstacle to the 5 C's. It's an obstacle to more physical activity for girls. It's an obstacle to civic engagement. It's an obstacle to an embodied sexuality. And at the same time, all of those ideas are the alternative and the counterweight to the messages that girls are getting beamed at them. So what's new here is not that sexualization exists. I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time, but mostly with older girls. What's new is that it's skewing younger and that it's growing more intense, and that I argue it starts in toddlerhood or even infancy with the fetishized obsession with pink and princesses. Now, pink is not intrinsically bad, but it's such a tiny slice of the rainbow, and while on one hand it can celebrate girls, on the other hand, it persistently fuses girls' identity to appearance, and then it presents that appearance and that connection not only as innocent, but as evidence of innocence, so that being obsessed with pink and pretty is what makes you a girl, is what makes you innocent. So you have the Pretty Pretty Princess board game, the Little Mermaid Vanity and Salon. I love this one, the Princess with a Loving Heart makeup kit. There you have, what number C are we on? Are we on 9 now? Number 9 would be cosmetics. You make your own mirror kit. And as girls get even just a little bit older, 3, 4, 5, that pink and pretty starts to skew more towards sassy, which is sexy with training wheels, and also towards shopping as being a natural outgrowth of girlhood, and in fact what defines you as a girl. So you have, here's a placemat from a pizza parlor in Pennsylvania, pink around the edges. So the little girl is supposed to color in the first group of things, the purse, the cell phone, the shopping bag. You have a word search there where you can search for mall queen, diva, born to shop. You have the unscramble, nail polish, cell phone, and you have the ever popular get the shoe, find the shoe to the shopping bag maze. So that's what you do while you're waiting for your pizza. I know, it's funny, right? And it seems aberrant, but it's really not. Here's all the new pink board games, versions of classic board games. All the things girls love is the tagline for the new Monopoly, where they have replaced the houses with boutiques and the hotels with malls. You have Uno Chic, you have Yahtzee, where they have replaced the numbers on the dice with hearts, flip-flops, cell phones, dresses, flowers. And those are Scrabble racks from the new pink Scrabble. And guess what? Fashion is a 7-letter word. Nice, huh? So this was my introduction to the kind of diva princessification of girlhood. My daughter, when she was 7, got the It's So Me, make your own messenger kit. Again, fusing identity with and self-expression with fashion and decoration. What you don't see on the cover of this is that among the iron-on transfers included were ones that said spoiled and brat. And to her credit, thank goodness, my daughter said, "Mom, why do they want me to put spoiled on my purse?" And I said, "I don't know, honey, let's throw that away." But it's part of what I have begun to think of as girls' power, girls with a Z, girls' power. Anytime you see that Z, you're in big trouble. And in girls' power, self-absorption is sold to girls as self-confidence, and a girl's autonomy and power, her very identity as a female, is expressed through materialism, narcissism, and putting spoiled on your purse. So where girl power in the 90s, way back when, was sort of the freedom from the pursuit of physical perfection, now girls' power is the freedom to pursue physical perfection. Another Z way that I think of it is it's the Kim Kardashianization of girlhood. That's Kim Kardashian. What you get with that then is as girls get older, there's the new dolls that have you begging for Barbie. Moxie girls, those are Thai girls, Moxie girls, Brats, note the Z's again, and Monster High is the newest line, which you'll be seeing a lot more of. There's the rise of the spa birthday party for preschool and elementary school girls. That's the Bippity Boppity Boutique in Disneyland, where for $200 your girl can get made over as her favorite princess. That's a spa birthday party. This is a mall store called Raspberry Lips, where girls go to be girls, because this is what it means to be a girl. And that's actually a picture of somebody's blog of their daughter that I took. So that's not even a, that's, somebody's happy about that. The craft kits for girls are increasing. This is the Creativity for Kids company. Creativity, what's it about? It's about make your own pedicure kit, the make your own lip balm kit, the nail art kit. Science becomes about perfume and spas. And there is this endless parade of pink poodles in purses, 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 more pink poodles in purses. I saw these all at the toy fair. Pink poodles in purses, leopard print pink poodles in purses, pink poodles in purses, sweet thing, pink poodle in a purse, pink poodle in a purse, and zebra pink poodle in a purse. Because poodles in the purse are, I swear to God, there were like 100,000 of these at the toy fair. And because they're the symbol, right? They're the symbol of Paris Hilton. They're the symbol of this spoiledness and the idea that your power comes from this princess-like entitlement to whatever you want because you want it, and not through earning it, and goodness knows not through any kind of civic engagement or interest in other people. And the other piece of that then is that what you're seeking is to be, and what you need, and for your validation, is to be seen and looked at and admired. And the apotheosis of that is being famous. Famous for what? Heck if I know. Why are Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton famous? What did they do? I don't know. They're famous for being famous. And in fact, there was a study from the Children's Digital Media Center in UCLA, and I'll be talking about them a little more later, that looked at the values projected in media aimed at preteens, 16 values over the last 10 years. And they found a flip, whereas 10 years ago, fame was number 15 on the list. It had now jumped to number 1. So in girl culture, how this migrates downward is in the pink Tinker Toys, which are designed especially for girls, they can build a butterfly, a microphone, a flower, and more. What the heck is microphone doing in that sentence, right? What is that microphone? And Dora, I don't know if you guys have seen the new Dora. The new Dora is Dora the Explorer. Is taller, skinnier, prettier, has long hair, more fashionable outfit. She's dumped the backpack, she's dumped the map, she's dumped Boots the monkey, but she's got those boots. And instead of climbing rocks now, Dora rocks. So she too has gone famous. And the truth is that little girls aren't really supposed to be looking at Kim Kardashian as a role model, but they are supposed to be progressing from the animated princesses to the flesh and blood princesses. And the flesh and blood princesses, of course, are, Miley, Selena, Demi. I don't know, maybe you guys aren't even clued into this media, but this is it. So when these girls, it doesn't really matter which one you're talking about, they go through the same cycle. And at first they're marketed as utterly wholesome. Miley wore a promise ring that she was going to be a virgin until she got married. So did Selena. They don't wear them anymore. Miley told Oprah when she was just turned 15 that she looked way young and she liked it that way, and that she chooses clothes that girls love and moms approve of. And exactly 3 months after that interview, she was in Vanity Fair and sparked a scandal for looking like she just got out of bed with her lover. But I think the other picture is way skeevier with her dad. That's her dad. That's really weird. But that's Miley at 15, Miley at 17, Miley at 18. Unfortunately, I put the wrong slides at the end of this, so this is the slide that's going to be up the rest of the time unless somebody changes it. But there she is in her bustier in a cage. And again, sexuality is not the issue here. Sexualization is. The issue is that these girls, whether they are singers or actresses, that their wholesomeness is commodified, that their virginity becomes a marketing gimmick, and that inevitably then what comes after becomes a marketing gimmick and commodified as well. So that what girls learn over and over again is that self-objectification is a feminine rite of passage. So you take that you take that 13-year-old girl, or increasingly 11-year-old girl, particularly Facebook has their way because they're trying to get rid of the COPPA Act, and she's been marinated in that culture since she was a toddler, and you put her on Facebook with her 622 BFFs. And suddenly she becomes her own mini Miley, complete with this adoring fan base that she has to maintain. And what the Children's Digital Media Center has been seeing is that girls are, no surprise, rewarded for the most positive feedback when they post provocative photos of themselves, as long as they don't go too far, because then their audience, just like the audience of the superstar girls, turns against them. So very much like these stars, girls are engaged in this increasingly public negotiation between trying to appear sexy but not slutty. And that high wire act, as much as anything, I think belies the lie of the culture that says that this sexualization is empowering to girls. Because if it were, they would leave their childhood with more control over their sexuality, more agency, instead of either the same or even less, because now it can, that picture can be spread far and wide. And speaking of that, there was a 2009 poll by the AP that found that 22% of teenage girls had posted or sent nude or semi-nude photos of themselves, which was confusing to me because part of me thought, well, maybe this is one of these sex panics, and maybe this is a sign that girls are in fact feeling like they have some sexual agency and they can, express themselves and do what they want. So what did I do? What I always do, I called the sexpert. I called Deb, who's over there typing away, and I asked her, Deb is my guru, and she said this wonderful thing that I have been, quoting ever since, and that we were talking about yesterday, which is that sexual agency itself has become the latest performance for girls, and it's something that they now do or prove rather than experience. And she told me that, I'm going to just quote you, okay? When she asked girls to describe an experience of how an experience of arousal felt, that increasingly they were telling her how they felt they looked. And she had to remind them that looking good was not a feeling. So they had totally conflated and internalized this idea that being desirable was the same as feeling desire. And so electronic media, it's such a series of funhouse mirrors. It can forge greater intimacy, it can undermine greater intimacy, it can do both at the same time. And we're often told that we adults are immigrants to that land and our kids are natives. And, like Brian, I kind of feel like yes and no. I feel like, yeah, they can use the technology, with their thumbs are faster than mine. But the issues, while they may go nuclear online, go further, go faster, they're the same things. And so kids need to develop the same kind of skills and control and power over what they do when they go online, and that's the education that they need. And there are some really great programs out there that are modeling that, and one of my favorites, which both Deb and I are involved in, is SPARK, which stands for Sexualization, Protest, Action, Resistance, and Knowledge. And it's a coalition of organizations that encourages girls and makes a space for girls to be producers, to get their hands on the levers of power, and to produce blogs or videos or take various actions that critique the media and give them back the control and the power to talk back and to create their own, to create an alternative voice, to create an alternative space. Oops, that's my thing telling me that I'm done. And isn't that nice? And so I'll just say, there are more like that. That's one of my favorites. It's sparksummit.com. And they also have Spark kits that you can download, which have actions and projects that girls can do, but that adults can facilitate, that, again, put the control in the hands of girls and give them a counter-narrative to the one that's being beamed at them, because we have to spark that counter-narrative if we don't want our girls to be princesses, and we want them to find a real happily ever after. So, thank you.
I feel a little nauseous from all the pink, I have to say. So thank you, Peggy. So our next speaker is Dr. Connie Yowell. She's the Director of Education at the MacArthur Foundation. She focuses on grants relating to public education and on the implications for education of young people's use of digital media. She was previously an associate professor in the School of Education at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she studied reasons why Latino youth drop out of high school. Her talk today is entitled Reimagining Learning in the 21st Century.
Good morning, everyone. I want to start off by saying thank you to Patrick for putting this conference together and your leadership and vision in doing that. I think it's just a terrific event. And I also want to say a special thanks to Ellen Daniels and her team for their work in putting the conference together. I think they've just been fantastic. I don't know if Ellen's in the room, but thanks so much. And I also want to say, Deborah, that I think our panel wins. We have said sex, sexuality, and sexualization more than any other panel, and I'm not going to at all, so we're done, but I think we win. I'm a little bit of an outlier here at the conference, I think, in terms of being the only funder, so what I want to do today is to give you a little bit of background on what we've been doing at the MacArthur Foundation around digital media and learning. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the findings from the research and the work that we've supported, and then I want to end by giving you a sense of a couple of the opportunities that we're funding, because after all, that's what foundations do, hopefully, is that we create opportunities for others to engage in. So first, by way of background, I advanced the slides. In 2005, at MacArthur, we decided that we were going to end all of our grant making in traditional school reform. We realized that at the time we had a $45 million initiative in traditional school reform in Chicago and nationally, and we realized that we were actually making very little, if any, difference. We decided to stop that work and to instead try to get a sense of what the future might look like, and to have a better understanding of how kids were using digital media, to have a better understanding of what the future might look like in terms of learning with digital media. So we took a major step backward and we asked just one simple question, and that is, how are young people changing as a result of digital media? We were looking at it in terms of socializing, in terms of learning, and in terms of civic engagement. And as usually happens when you start with one good question, it leads to a couple more good questions. And so we were soon asking at least 3 other questions, and we have now ended up with an $85 million plus initiative in digital media and learning that is looking at young people's learning. It's looking at new advances in learning environments, and it's also looking at the implications for social, civic, and learning institutions, as well as what it might mean to create a new field in a time of rapid change. We would argue that we're in a huge transitional moment for learning and for education, and that we have to take advantage of this. So what I want to do is to give you 2 core findings that have really, from the research that we funded, that are really defining our work. We certainly have a plethora of findings, but I just want to focus on 2 today to give you a sense of the direction that we're moving in. And these findings come out of a large ethnographic study, because really where we started was focusing on the kids, and we wanted to learn very much from what the kids were doing outside of school with the tools and how they were approaching learning. And so this is probably the largest ethnographic study, over 700 kids, 3 years, 25 researchers involved, ever done. And it's been followed up with quantitative studies as well. So and this in many respects follows on much of what Craig started us off with this morning. And it starts off with, we've got a ton of studies on media usage, which is how many hours a day are kids using digital media. Many fewer studies on what they're actually doing with the digital media during those hours. And so the ethnographic study really helped to identify 2 genres of participation. One genre our researchers called friendship-driven participation. The second genre our researchers called interest-driven participation. And the first genre is the one that you all know incredibly well because it's the one that the media focuses on, and it's the one that most of our conversations this morning have been related to. And that is what kids do with their social groups. And it turns out that kids do online with their social groups exactly what they do offline. They're simply taking the gossiping, the friendship, the peer status that they do offline, and they're moving them online. So what happens on Facebook actually looks very much like what we all used to do for those of us that went to the mall and hung out. What we did at the mall, kids now do on Facebook. They're just hanging out and taking all of those behaviors online. It's just that now kids are significantly more isolated, right? They're both in urban areas and in rural areas. Kids are not interacting in social areas in the ways that we used to. And even those kids that can get out, often their friends can't get out. And so they are using the online world as a means to stay connected. And so we actually find this not particularly interesting when it comes to learning, although the media finds it particularly interesting. And so all of the media stories are about what's happening in the social world. It turns out, though, that there's an entirely other kind of interaction happening online, which we very rarely hear about. And yet there are hundreds of thousands of kids engaged in what our researchers have called interest-driven learning and participation. And interest-driven learning participation is what is happening when kids are particularly interested in getting better at something. It is competence-driven, it is knowledge-driven, it is intergenerational, and it is also peer-driven. And so when kids are following their hobbies, following their pursuits, they're doing it online. And it might be in video games, it might be in fan fiction, it might be in anime, and it can also be in the things that we're all familiar with like chess, it could be in science. Astronomy is huge in terms of online communities. And I want to give you just one example of what a little bit of what it looks like, just to give you a sense. It's going to be soon a dated example, but most people know Harry Potter. So Harry Potter is an example of fan fiction. And fan fiction is when kids take something that's quite popular in the culture and they remake it or remix it for their own. So it turns out that there are literally hundreds of thousands of kids in the online communities rewriting Harry Potter. And they're rewriting Harry Potter in very structured and in very organized communities. So Fiction Alley is a community that has hundreds of thousands of kids in it. This is an example of a forum. And I'm not sure if you can see it or if it's blurry. But a forum is a space where you can go in and click on any one of those topics and find tens of thousands of kids having discussions. They can be discussions about plot. They can be discussions about character. They can be discussions about grammar. And so kids are actually creating whole new characters, whole new chapters, whole new even books that are related to the Harry Potter theme and series. This is an example of kids having a conversation about character development. One kid has written a whole new chapter for one of the Harry Potter books with whole new characters in it, and another kid is giving that person lots of feedback on what they think about the character. And so this is not specific to Harry Potter. There are lots of other books and series where kids are just rewriting and doing extraordinary literature online. And so what we see in these fan fiction communities, in these interest-driven communities, is what those of us from the education community would say that John Dewey would drool over. These are extraordinary learning opportunities. It's the best of what the digital world, we think, has to offer. And these are some of the core characteristics in terms of they're being peer-based, social, interest-driven, networked. They're about participation in all the ways that Craig talked about, and they're about kids producing and making. So the question then is, in many respects, how do kids find these interest-driven communities? I have two kids of my own. One is an incredibly interest-driven kid, and I've got lots of not-so-great pottery all over my house. I spend half my time taking him to all the events that he cares about. And I have another kid who would love to spend his entire life in his pajamas in front of the TV, which drives me batty and worries me for his future. But one of the findings from the research study in terms of how kids find these worlds online is that they're first hanging out with their friends. They're in their social world. It could be with their friends, it could be with their sibs. They're online. The kids use the word lurking. So they're hanging out with their friends and they're seeing what they're doing. What are you doing? Oh, that looks really interesting. Maybe I want to try that. And then they start messing around. They start tinkering. They start playing with something that looks of interest to them. And then they think, oh, maybe I'm good at that. Maybe this is something I'm interested in. Maybe I want to try that out. And then the kids, in their own words, start geeking out. They move into the interest-driven community. So that becomes a trajectory of sorts of how kids both discover from their peers, from their sibs, from their friends, different kind of interests or hobbies or activities that they might be interested in. They have to have the opportunity to mess around, to tinker, before they begin to geek out. So think about that, though, in terms of what that means for how we structure kids' worlds. There are two things I want to point out. We just did a survey in Chicago of all the programs that we make available for kids in the after-school world. 90% of the programs are only about geeking out. They're only about kids who have already identified their interests and want to go deep. None of the programs had the combination of hanging out and messing around. So that means a couple of things. When it comes to the middle school age kids and the high school age kids, we have almost no opportunities for kids to mess around. If you think about what we do for elementary kids, I think we do it exceptionally well. We let them fail. We let them mess around. We let them play. We let them pretend. We let them iterate. As soon as you get to middle school, things count. We expect you to start figuring out what your identity is and to go deep. Almost no tinkering. In a world of rapid change, in a world where every 5 years you're going to change what your career is, we have to start letting kids understand that iteration, tinkering, messing around is critical to learning. The second thing that's really critical is the relationship between friendship and interest-driven. If you think about it, most kids, when they want to start getting better at something or diving deep into something, they end up leaving their friendships. They end up leaving their social world in order to go and get better at something. We almost never allow those two worlds to stay connected. And yet it's critically important for kids to have those social supports, those friendships, as they take the risks at starting to get better at something. We see that supported in the online world. We actually don't see it supported in the offline world. And so part of the question then becomes, how do we think about this in terms of the next generation? What does this mean for our institutions? Which, and Craig pointed this out really nicely, are hugely challenged. Most of our learning institutions and our civic organizations are organized around 19th century models of learning. And so how do we begin to move them into the 21st century? So I want to give you two examples, one about institutional change and one about policy, that are also, I think, opportunities, I hope, for engagement for folks in this room. The first one is that we've been doing a lot of work with libraries. There's probably no better institution that is a model of consumption and not a model of participation in production than a library. And so we've been working with the Chicago Public Library to begin to think, well, how can we reimagine what the future of the library is in terms of the next generation? And so there's a space in the Chicago Public Library that is now called UMedia, and it is a space that is particularly focused around kids as interest-driven, knowledge producers, makers and producers. And it is divided into 3 parts. It has a hanging out space, a messing around space, and a geeking out space. It has a recording studio in it. It, of course, has a fair amount of digital media so that kids can be making video games, can be doing documentary films, et cetera. It also has a performance space, because we know that from the kids that we've studied, that performance of what they've made and produced and getting peer feedback is extraordinarily important to them. It has mentors. It is incredibly important in terms of what we've been understanding at the intergenerational nature of these interest-driven groups online, for mentors to be a part of the youth community. So this is not about youth versus adult. This is about defining new roles for adults in relationship to kids, in relationship to their interests, as kids move from hanging out to messing around to geeking out. It has an online social network so that the space is actually 24/7, so that learning can happen anywhere, anytime. And lastly, it combines analog and digital, so that all of the work that goes on in the library is actually about remixing the resources of the library. So the kids are remixing the books, they're remixing the jazz collection, they're remixing the maps. The checking out of books in the library has actually gone up 700-fold in the youth space. So lest we think that this is about digital versus analog, from the youth perspective, we're not seeing that at all. We're seeing the youth being quite adept at meshing analog and digital. And so what this means in terms of opportunity is that we're now in collaboration with the Institute for Museum and Library Services. That's the federal arm of the government that funds libraries and museums, to create 25 new UMedia spaces around the country. And we're hoping we'll be picking our first 10 in November, and our next 25 in the following spring. And so we're hoping that folks in your communities or in spaces that will be needing researchers, evaluators, and folks who are interested in looking at mentorship, as well as in looking at the relationship between friendship and interest-driven practices, both online and in face-to-face communities, to be joining us in this work. And so we think both, and the Knight Foundation and several other foundations, Gates as well, will be joining us in this work as we begin to build it out, both in terms of online and as well as face-to-face. The second opportunity that I wanted to talk to you about for a little bit today is that from the policy perspective, institutions are not going to change, of course, until we completely reimagine what assessment looks like. Our outcomes conversation, in many respects, is a very narrowed conversation that, I have to say, lacks imagination. And so if we really want to begin to rethink what our institutions look like, if we really want to begin to tackle some of the digital literacy questions that Craig was going to get at in his presentation, and really think about the skills for the future and the capacities and the dispositions that kids are developing, we actually probably need a whole new conversation about outcomes and assessment. And so we've launched a $2 million national competition to develop what we are calling, and what most people call badges, which will be new forms of assessment. So when you think about badges, don't think about Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. Think about digital portfolios. Think about constant feedback on how one is doing, because that's what you can do in the digital world. Don't think about stickers, but think about competency and performance-based kinds of assessments. And also, part of what we're trying to do here is disrupt the entire conversation about assessment in terms of the who, what, where, when, and why of outcomes and assessment. So right now, who gets to assess? It's a single institution. It's the education institution, right? Why shouldn't other organizations be engaged in the process of assessing? Why shouldn't after-school programs have just as much power as the schools? Why shouldn't some of the youth development programs also be a part of that conversation? What gets assessed? Why is it only, particularly as we narrow down to the Common Core curriculum, our assessments are only going to focus on 3 or 4 things? Why shouldn't we be broadening that conversation to have a much deeper and richer conversation about what matters in the 21st century for what should be learned? Why shouldn't we be talking about the digital literacies that Craig was going to raise? And also, where should it be assessed? Why aren't we talking about learning as 24/7? Kids are learning anywhere, anytime now. Why are we only talking about learning as happening in siloed institutions as opposed to across networked communities? So let's not open up that conversation, and that's what we want to do with the badges. And the last thing that we want to do is to really reimagine policy. So policy right now only happens within an expert-driven community in closed-door conversations. And so part of what we're doing with the badges work is trying to create a national, if not an international, our competition is international, conversation about what assessment can look like. So we have a whole set of collaborators that have joined us that are going to be developing badges with us. We would like to invite you into the conversation to join us. You are all welcome and invited to both join the conversation about what assessment can and should look like, to become researchers in the process. Our competition is both open to research, and it's open to people who want to design, provide content into the badge conversation. And it's also going to be part of Mozilla is our partner. Mozilla has created the Firefox browser. So we actually have an open badge infrastructure where all of the badges will sit. So in the future, think about iTunes Store or think about the Android Store so that you can think about badges sitting in an open marketplace as opposed to a closed, expert-driven, only a few people get to decide what kinds of assessments matter. So we would love to have you join us in the conversation. There are lots of ways to join us in terms of websites. I don't know if people here use Twitter, but we have a whole conversation going on Twitter. Those are hashtags at the bottom. And it would be great to have you join the conversation and have your expertise at the table as we have this conversation over the next year and a half. Because we think this is part of how digital media can affect a policy conversation at the same time that it can open up the entire conversation around what learning looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. So we have some time for questions and discussion. And as previously, please just head on up to the microphones. I can get us started with a discussion question if you want. So one thing, sort of thinking about linking this to some of the past conversations, some things you've all brought up, I'm wondering about thinking about new forms of media and technologies and new ways of engaging with media and how this changes our ideas about the meaning of citizenship. So what does it mean to be an engaged citizenship in this 21st century world? What are the ways of being engaged? And what are the implications of this for the types of skills and competencies that youth need to be engaged citizens? So I'll throw that out there to get us started.
Is this on? I can just say, in the context of some of the responses to the Prop 8 campaign in California, which was what basically overruled same-sex marriage in California after it had been legal for a short time, much of the political mobilization in response to that was done by young people on the internet, starting campaigns like No Hate, No H8, that led to marches throughout the country. So there was a really interesting interplay between online and offline organization. Young people using things like Twitter and Facebook and media campaigns to organize politically in response to this occurrence. And having gone to some of these rallies in various places around the country, these were grassroots, youth-led events, political organization, and it was really amazing and really inspiring to see young people so worked up. And I think it actually was really interesting to me to see how some of the earlier generations of activists were, I think sort of struck by how youth had so effectively organized online and, I think had chances to learn from young people around how to use the internet and new media as a way for political organization.
I have a couple of comments related to that. We do a fair amount of funding in the area of open government and civic innovation. So I think one of the things that is happening and will continue to happen, particularly as our states and our cities face the consequences of an enormous recession, is that there is a continuing opening up of government to citizens and to entrepreneurs and to community experts to help in the running and solving of community and civic problems. And so I think part of what we'll see in our next generation of youth and our next generation of civic engagement is actually, crowdsourcing is too strong a word, but the opening up of and the need for the community to engage in civic problem solving, and that our citizens and our kids will actually need to know how to solve problems and need complex problems and need to know how to participate in those online communities and know how to be citizens in what is both a new way in terms of doing it online and solving complex problems, but in an old way, which is what we always intended for our government to be run, which was with citizens as the problem solvers at the heart. And so I think I am concerned that our kids are not yet being prepared to do this. I think they're not learning how to participate in complex problem solving online. I think they're not understanding systems thinking, which is at the very heart of the complex problems that they're going to need to solve. I think they're not understanding government and open government in the ways that they're going to need to know how to do that. And so I think they're not understanding, we use a phrase called intelligent resourcing, which is how do you get the information that you need on demand in order to solve the problem at hand. So it's not so much memorizing a ton of facts, but it's about how do you galvanize all of the resources around you, both online and face-to-face, in order to bring that information to bear on the problems as they emerge. And I think our schools are certainly not preparing our kids to do that. And so as a community, we need to begin to think about how we're going to prepare our kids for that kind of governance in the future.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And so for the project that I was mentioning in terms of what we're doing in the classroom, specifically, there's a civic engagement kind of element or component kind of built into the work that we're trying to do. And so we did some pre-testing survey work, just trying to get a sense of the degree to which these students identify as citizens. the degree to which they have had access to opportunities to participate in sort of civic life, their communities, their schools, because we know from the research literature, right, that there is this kind of civic kind of achievement gap, but there's also what Joseph Kahn and others have talked about as an opportunity gap, right, that some kids don't have the types of opportunities that other kids might have, and this tracks along race and class and parental education and other things, the kinds of opportunities to participate in civic life. So that was one of the reasons we wanted to get into the classroom to build this project, to see what would happen if in fact kids were sort of encouraged and even given an opportunity to express themselves as citizens and to think critically about the issues that they're facing. For me, living in a state like Texas, and that graph from the census that I showed you, this is not just unique to Texas, but the demographics are striking. So Texas is one of the few states that grew in terms of its child population, and 95% of that growth was driven by Latino youth. And this is something that we're beginning to see in other states as well. And a lot of the problems that have been discussed here, particularly thinking about the first panel yesterday dealing with issues of fitness and health and childhood obesity, the populations that are disproportionately impacted by those kinds of outcomes and circumstances are the very populations where we see growth happening, particularly amongst young people. And so I think that it is absolutely critical to equip young people with the skills, with the capacity to engage in civic life, with the capacity to solve problems, because those are the very real problems that they're living with. Those are the very real problems that they see every day. And until we begin to create and build situations and environments where they're able to sort of see themselves as agents of impact and agents of change, I think we're failing them in that regard. And this came up last night, but for a number of young people, civic engagement is now very much a part of their digital lives. Or I should say that technology, right, is one of the ways in which they now access participation in the civic world. And we did some survey looking at young people's use of Facebook, for example, a few years ago. And when we asked them questions about the use of Facebook and to what degree do issues of civic importance, community issues, political issues come up, we found it quite striking that for a noteworthy percentage of young people, particularly African American and Latinos, those become spaces where they can talk about issues that it may be difficult to talk about in other places. So the ways in which they're building these kinds of informal kinds of civic ecologies and communities, I think are something that we should think about. Some really interesting research that I just came across about HIV and AIDS in the African American community, and why for some, the online world has become one of the few places where they can have honest conversations about the way in which this disease is impacting young African Americans and Latinos.
On our left.
Hopefully we've run out of time and I won't ask this question. Have we run out of time?
No, we have not.
No. Wayne Barry with the Virginia Department of Education. I'm not speaking as an employee of the Virginia Department of Education. I'm speaking as a parent who has luckily, successfully helped two youngsters survive childhood, adolescence, and they're into young adulthood. And all four talks were extremely provocative. And at the end of your talk, Connie, I was transported back to the 50s when I grew up, and I said, who was that masked man? I mean, it was you just were powerful, and following on what Peggy had to say, Peggy suggested to me the media as an institution is raising many children. And schools are partners with parents in this very delicate task. And so it's quite logical that as a co-parent, schools would get into that stuff that exists between education and families. But then, Connie, you suggested that this badge thing, which I haven't got my head around yet, but you've asked us to weigh in. I see a real opportunity to empower parents again. How is the MacArthur Foundation promoting to parents, not to competitive institutions raising our kids? So if you could begin to answer that, that
Sure.
would be helpful to me anyway.
Sure. and I'll be frank and say I have to think about parents and badges, but so let me think about that. But I want to respond, 'cause I was going to make this comment informally. To connect a little bit of my presentation to Peggy's presentation, and that is that we have a huge, and also to say I'm not convinced, although I'm really thinking about it, I feel like I've parachuted into the positive youth development conversation here today, which I really have appreciated. I've not been in the conversation for several years. And I'm really trying to think hard. I'm not convinced that risk versus positive development is the right binary or is particularly helpful right now. And so in part because I think that the bigger concern, and maybe it can be wrapped into that binary or wrapped into that frame, is what might be the juxtaposition between what Peggy was talking about and what I was talking about, which is to say 95 to 99% of all kids are in friendship-driven participation communities. What Peggy was talking, that's where media consumption happens. And it happens extraordinarily well. There are no adults there. That kids are not, and when it comes to media consumption and when it comes to deep digital media engagement, by and large, what our research is telling us is that parents have absented from that conversation. And they're using old parenting techniques, which is to say they regulate. It's either on or off, right? Because that's what my parents did when it was with TV or music, it was turn it off. And when they got really sophisticated, they would say turn it down, right? But that's not where we are now. Digital media is about participation. These tools are extraordinarily powerful learning tools. You don't want your kids to turn them off, but you certainly don't want them consuming thousands of hours a day. And so our kids are not, it's a myth, I hate this term digital native. Mm-hmm. Kids are not digital natives. They don't know really what is worth consuming. They don't necessarily know deep participation, and that's the gap that Craig was talking about. Right, that's the have and have not. So our concern for the future is not about a digital access divide. Our concern for the future is a digital participation divide. And that kids without help from mentors or from adults who are participating with them, alongside them, are not going to learn the deep participation, the making, doing, the critiquing, the iterating. That's what's so critical. We're not engaging our kids on the critique that Peggy was calling for. Right, our kids should be remixing and doing strong critiques of Pink and all the things that Peggy was talking about. That's where they should be. That's what fan fiction is about. That's what the interest-driven communities are about. But we only have between 15 and 20% at tops of our kids in interest-driven communities. We have 95 to 99% of our kids in friendship-driven communities. And that's because we don't have the hanging out to messing around to geeking out trajectories developed. It's because we don't have mentors and adults engaging our kids and moving them along that trajectory. We're leaving them in the hanging out space. And that's problematic, and that's where we're going to lose the next generation of kids, and we're going to have a huge divide. We're not going to have makers, producers, and creators. That's what our economy needs. That's what our complex problem solving needs. That's what our civic engagement needs. And we're going to have an extraordinary divide, in part because we're keeping it out of schools, and in part because we have adults have absented ourselves from that conversation and from our kids in that conversation. And again, I can't tell you enough, it's not about regulation. I mean, I even have that tendency with my kids. I want to say, okay, turn it off. But that's not what it's about. It is about participating with them and understanding and helping to develop the dispositions and the literacies that Craig was talking about so that they can turn away from that. And so that they can then go out into these different communities and hopefully gain the badges and earn the kinds of things that then can become transparent. So one of the things that we also know that the 15 and 20%ers, the geeks and the dorks and the freaks, as they call themselves, that are really deep into these communities, have extraordinary skills, capacities, and dispositions for learning that nobody knows about. So part of our intent around the badges is let's make those skills and capacities and dispositions transparent. And we also know from the National Association of Manufacturers has joined us in the badge work. Those are the skills they're dying for in the work world. And it would be true for youth builders as well. I'm sure that there are extraordinary numbers of skills that your kids are learning that we can make transparent that the schools aren't going to acknowledge, but that the work world is going to acknowledge immediately. And why not empower that? And so that's part of what we're after. I hope that answers a little bit of your question.
I like to use the technical term about the immigrant versus neighbor divide, that it's crap. It really is, and it's something that I think disempowers adults.
Yeah.
When we talk about it, and also that analogy of the mall, I use a lot too, that our kids are growing up online, and the making and doing and creating, and it is the way to give the power back to the kids, is to get them making, get them doing, get them creating their own media, their own critique, and get those competencies and literacy. So I guess I just want to say, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Lemenestrel with the 4-H National Headquarters at the Department of Agriculture, and I have two questions. One for Peggy, as the parent of a 13-year-old girl who's bombarded with all the images that you shared. Mm-hmm. What are some positive ways in which you've seen that girls are engaging in kind of trying to counteract these sexualization messages that they're getting? And then a question for Craig about, you mentioned the difference in the quality of experiences between mobile technology, internet access, and I guess more traditional computer, laptop, et cetera. And if you could say a little bit more about what you have learned about the difference in the quality of those experiences. Thank you.
Well, I think there's a creativity that has to be put onto this, that there's an illusion of choice in the world of girls, that you have a choice to be girly, or you have a choice to do all this pink stuff, when really it's billions of dollars of marketing aimed at you. So there's a way that you have to. There was something else I was going to say earlier that I'll say in a minute, but Halloween is coming up, right? Pornoween, Slutoween, whatever you want to call it these days, right? So there's a contest which you can see at Spark or at what's thank you, Holla Back, HOLLA back, where they're having a contest to do what they're calling body positive costumes, which means costumes that don't emphasize body parts, and they're having this big contest and taking take your picture, send it in, wear your Elmo it has to be a costume you make, your Elmo costume, your Fuzzy Dice costume, whatever it is, and that is a way to disrupt the conversation, is to give girls another way that they can be, to counteract it. And similarly, if you look on Spark, or you look at About Face San Francisco or some of these other places, girls making media that critique, girls blogging in ways that critique, girls going into their schools. There was a case recently of a group of girls in Texas who just said, you know what, we're not going to wear makeup anymore. And it kind of spread as a concept throughout the school. Or the girls in Connecticut who refused to wear the new skimpy cheerleader outfits that they were given. So there are examples of girls who stand up and educate their community. What I was going to say before with Connie, I'm sorry, I'm so tired, I forgot it, was that we tend to put these, the culture and the positive attributes and competencies and literacies that we want our kids to have in this box over here. And the pop culture box is over here. And ne'er the twain shall meet. And I think that one of the ways that we have to think about, which I think you're getting at and alluding to, is that we have to make channels between those boxes, and not only find ways to help kids deal with the messages that are unhealthy that they're getting, but also to help them disrupt them and to understand them ourselves, so that we can give them the tools that they can disrupt them with and merge those boxes a little bit.
So I think, if I would have had more time, I would have liked to focus a little bit more on just, but I think as we sort of shifted away from thinking primarily about this as an issue of access, the digital equity issue, and really more about sort of the context and the environment in which young people are now using technology. I mean, this is what makes the mobile device so interesting, and mobile phones in particular. So when you look at all of this data that's suggesting that Latino and African American youth are far more active in terms of the mobile devices. So the paradox, right? I remember when Apple and Steve Jobs launched the iPad, and for the big sort of announcement and the big event that they became sort of famous for, and he became famous for, he kept constantly describing the iPad as like holding the internet in your hand. And this is the very beginning, I think, of 2010, January 2010, and I was thinking about the kids that we had been meeting for the last 3 years or so who are already holding the internet in their hand. And the question that I kept asking myself is, but what type of internet are they holding in their hand? And what does that internet allow them to do? And to the extent that we see kids primarily gravitating to mobile because of the things that they can consume via the device, we see it primarily being what Connie was referring to as kind of this interest-driven, kind of peer-driven tool. But we know, right, that mobile can also be a very powerful learning engine and a very powerful learning tool. So we're trying to sort of reimagine and sort of coming up with other alternatives for how the mobile device can be used. So asking kids to take their mobile devices and use them, right, as ways of collecting data, research, photos, video, things of this nature. And sort of flipping sort of their own kind of understanding of what the technology that they already own in their pocket could potentially provide in terms of being a tool, being a resource. But I think it really is about sort of the context in which young people are using technology, and really beginning to think about the degree to which, again, not all sort of adoption and forms of technology use are equal, and how do we begin to understand the issues that impact that in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the familial, the communal, the educational, and kind of learning environments that kids are immersed in. And so I think there's a lot of potential with mobile, but in some communities that potential is less likely to be realized until we begin to create situated opportunities for them to realize it in that manner.
So Connie Flanagan, so I want to first briefly try to address Nancy's question about the civics and the digital. And then I want to ask a question about the binaries and the hanging out stuff, because yesterday, like, hanging out was discussed as problematic in community-based organizations. So maybe there's a way to get over the binaries by thinking of the hanging out and messing around and then geeking out thing that Connie said. Anyway, so I thought what Robert Garcia said I thought his presentation yesterday really, we got to talk about with respect to the internet. I thought what he was saying was like only paying attention to elections as times when we need to get engaged, that accountability between elections and knowing what the laws are and holding government accountable, is monitoring. So it seems to me, I haven't heard a lot of discussion about ways in which kids could learn to use the media to check what's government doing and are they being held accountable. But I also don't have much of a sense that kids feel like they have a right to do that yet. So I'd love to hear, we were talking last night at dinner about Grover Norquist and holding the Republicans accountable to, signing the no tax pledge. Well, in fact, what the whole social contract means is that we have a right to hold government accountable in a much broader way than that. But I really don't have a sense that kids feel that yet. Although technology could really enable them to do that. We have citizen journalism. Who was the guy from Virginia whose career went down the tubes because, so we have evidence that happens, and that that people, and that's a form of accountability. But I thought Robert was really raising really other ways that we could know the laws and hold our school systems as well as our elected officials accountable. But then I just want to sort of briefly ask, because when Connie said the hanging out generally is thought of as a risky sort of situation. So how can we move beyond that binary and see it as a natural progression of ways in which kids get engaged and learn?
You want me to go? Yeah. I was not here for Robert's presentation, so I'm not quite sure what you're asking, Connie, except I have a thought which might not be helpful. So, and it's a tech response, which is to say, and again, it's about how we sort of change our understanding of ourselves and our relationship to government. So that's both, as we know, there are lots of online sites that can provide information about how different parts of government are doing. We don't always have ways to then give feedback or connect into government. So it actually turns out, and this is something that MacArthur's probably going to be involved in funding. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Open 311. So Open 311 is something that cities have developed so that you can just call 311, and most people are using it for potholes. and to call in. It turns out that that technology is powerful enough that any sector can use it for people to call in and report on accountability around anything. So there's actually no reason why the educational system, for example, can't use that for parents to call in and create an entire database about how their schools are doing. And so part of it is that we actually do have ways for citizens to become involved, to collect data, to do, that's just an example. And so there's no reason why kids, for example, using Open 311 couldn't have a couple of core things that they were going to hold their city accountable to and be able just to call it in on their phone. So that the phone then becomes the tool for citizen engagement using this infrastructure that most cities will now have if we actually mobilized around it and took advantage of it. So that would be an example that probably within the next year or two, if we mobilized around it, could easily be done. And all kids have phones, and so we could easily do that. So that would be an example of how I think we could do that without much trouble. Yeah, so we have brought together, I'll just give you another example. So in Chicago and New York, we take very seriously what we have learned from the kids, which is that they are learning through networks as opposed to in siloed institutions. So in Chicago and New York, we have brought together 30 civic after-school cultural institutions to form learning networks. We call them, the kids wanted to call them hives. So we have the Chicago Hive Learning Network, and we have the New York Hive Learning Network. We have funds at the Chicago Community Trust and funds at the New York Community Trust for these organizations to come together, to collaborate, to create programs so that a kid can move seamlessly from the library to the aquarium to an after-school program in their community that are all linked and connected. What's been really clear from these organizations is that they are really uncomfortable with the hanging out. And they have all said, had it not been for the Chicago Public Library and their focus on hanging out and messing around and geeking out, they all said that's our proof point, that we think hanging out leads to risky behavior and adolescents acting badly, and we only want geeking out programs because that's when we can control kids. And that's when we know what they're doing. If we let them hang out, and the museum said to us, if we let them hang out, we put a security guard on them, because if we have an adolescent without a parent, we're going to follow him because we don't trust him. So part of our, I think, as a society, our adverse reaction to hanging out is that we don't trust adolescents. And so part of it is, how do you structure that? How do you enable it? And what is the trajectory that you want to connect that to? And so part of the reason we have the Connected Learning Research Network, and I might offer this as a little bit of an umbrella frame, is that just as you have risk and positive as a binary, kids live in extraordinarily fragmented worlds. And we leave it, particularly for adolescents, we leave it up to them to make the connections. So just as Peggy said, pop culture's over here, getting competent at something is over here, school's up here, their actual interests are over here, their friends are over here, their families over here, the media is, I mean, it's just nothing that the institutions are all disconnected, the policy community is disconnected, the media is disconnected, and so for any kid, it's each individual kid then has to make sense of all of this fragmentation and pull it together for themselves. And so part of what digital media could enable, as well as a different kind of paradigm in terms of thinking about what we want for our kids, is actually beginning to think through what a connected learning environment or sets of networked learning environments can look like for our kids that bring friendship and interest and academic rigorous pursuits together. And so that's part of what I think we need to be thinking about.
I was just going to add that, in addition to the interest-driven and kind of friendship-driven genres of participation that we've identified, I mean, it seems to me that, and I try to make a case for this in an upcoming piece in the International Journal for Learning and Media, that we should also add sort of civic genres of participation as well, because it's happening. We've come across kids who, we met kids in Texas who had migrated to Austin, Houston, and elsewhere from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and the ways in which they were using mobile and Facebook as a way to reestablish those connections and ties and peer networks that they had been torn apart from because of that epic storm. We've met kids who created public memorials for friends who have died because of homicidal violence, which has led to Facebook pages where there's streams and streams and streams of both adults and young people engaging in conversations about race, about poverty, and about violence, and about the state of their communities. And when I think about mobile and the example that you mentioned, I think a fairly recent example is the incident in Oakland and the BART train line where kids captured via their mobile devices, the young man being shot while he was laying down on the ground, and they became part of the evidence, right, for taking this case to trial, charging police officers with sort of reckless use of force. So these things are already happening, and in some ways, kids are figuring out some of this on their own. But I do agree, right, that to the extent that there's that kind of intergenerational dialogue, communication, and interaction, we can help further develop these kinds of interests that kids are already participating in. Oftentimes it's casual, not necessarily strategically organized or deliberate, but the kinds of civic-oriented conversations that they're having online can be quite striking if you actually follow and just watch and observe what they're doing and what they're saying via Facebook, via YouTube, even through their engagement with popular culture and the kinds of conversations that come up. It's really interesting.
So I have one quick comment, and then we have time for one last quick question. I think also it is, well, first of all, actually, George Allen is back, actually, for those of you not from Virginia, so his career didn't quite get buried. But it's also easier than ever, actually, to follow up on your politician. So you can look up how your politician voted on things, and you can do that. But that's not something that you're born knowing how to do. And so that's a skill you have to teach, right? And it seems to me that's a skill that can be taught in social studies classes. Here's how to find out who your elected officials are, and here's how to look up their voting record, and here's how to contact them if you don't like what they're doing. And that's a pretty easy way to build competency. So one last question.
I've been listening and trying to absorb and think about this issue. And I think, again, we see the polar opposites here between, and how digital media can be used. It's not a good thing necessarily. It's not a bad thing necessarily. And I think the same thing with after-school programming, for instance, and hanging out. And many after-school programs are actually iatrogenic, not because they're just geeked out based, but because they're hanging out based and there's nothing structured for kids to do and no adult supervision and those kinds of things. The programs that work best in after school allow for hanging out exploration, like Dan Offord's PALS program, skill development, and then once they get to the geeking out stage, giving them to natural organizations in a community that geek out. And I think the same paradigm has to apply here, and whether it's digital or non-digital, I don't think that makes a difference. It's just this process, which is exploration, kids understanding what their interests are, learning from other kids what those are, but then in a structured situation where they then learn skills to, talk to their congressperson or, get civically engaged, et cetera. The second piece that I want to make a comment on is that we do have the social media and the interest-driven media. And what is it, 95 and 20? How do we get the 20 to be 95 and the 95 to be more responsible? And it might be getting parents involved in that. But, honestly, on the cell phone, on my laptop, trying to do my homework is not a good way to do anything except create hyperactives. Now, I'm one of them. So maybe that's a really great thing, because you can be a researcher in the long run, but that's also, what are the impacts of that on learning? You have to understand those effects as well. So I think we have, and when we're trying to say we want to make change broadly among kids, how do we motivate anyone to be interested in anything but Pink and Barbie, and to be interested in something as boring as civic engagement? So those are the challenges ahead of us if we're not only going to be involving 10 to 20% of the creamiest people who are thinking about interest-driven, I'm going to write a new book. This isn't for everybody necessarily. How do we get all of the kids involved in this creative, not just the top 10 or 15%? That's what we want to do to make broad change rather than small change.
Yeah, I do want to respond to that. So a couple things. One is that, again, it's really important. We're not in disagreement on most of the things that you said, but it is really important to understand what participation looks like So a Kaiser study came out recently, a study on multitasking. And multitasking is in part a misnomer, particularly when it comes to kids, because often if a kid is on a social network, has their phone open, and is also doing their homework, all three things they're doing actually the same thing. And it's all related to the homework, it's all related to a singular task. So it may look like they're multitasking, but in fact they're not. So we really have to be careful and pay attention to actually what the experience of the kid is, as opposed to what our adult perception from the outside is on what the kid is doing. And that's part of why I think methodologically, ethnography and qualitative studies are incredibly important. And I wish more folks besides us would fund ethnographic and qualitative studies. And I'm constantly in conversation with the federal government about why they don't. So that's a plug for narrative, qualitative, and ethnographic studies, because we're at a moment in time when there may be opportunities for paradigmatic change, and you can't develop new theories and paradigmatic change without also doing qualitative and ethnographic study to really understand what's going on there. The second thing that I want to say is that one of the things that we've learned from really studying deep kid engagement is that it's actually kids are. I think it's. I don't think that engaging kids is a particularly difficult thing to do. I think that we have been an extraordinary society in terms of turning kids off. And so I think one of the things that we've learned from the digital media as we have studied design and really sort of understood digital engagement is that at a minimum, our designers talk about it, and I really like their language, so I'm going to use it here, is simply creating, kids have a need, when learning starts often with a need to know. And that if you have a hook that is about a need to know, if you think about narrative, if you think about fiction, if you think about a book that's a page turner, it's a page turner because you really want to know what's on the next page, right? A good video game is about having a need to know and wanting to get to that next level. That's what good learning is. That's what an interest is. And so when we're creating learning environments or experiences for kids, it's simply about creating a little bit of a need to know and then letting a kid go. And so we actually, in most of the designs and the learning environments and the institutions that we've been involved in, have had very little issue with engaging kids and interest. Most kids, actually, I have not seen them find civic engagement boring. When you start off with what their interest is, when you start off with a little bit of a need to know, it sort of takes off. And so I think part of the problem is how we have traditionally approached what it is to engage a kid, as opposed to starting with a youth's perspective. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, you know, maybe because of the nature of the work that I do, I don't think of things in it doesn't bother me. The binary contradiction doesn't bother me. You know, the both and idea doesn't bother me to get beyond that binary. But I do think, having said that, that just as you sort of draw these lines between sexualization and sexuality as helpful lines to understand what's going on with girls, the production versus consumption, or it should actually be the other way around to be parallel, but consumption versus production with new media is a helpful thing to just keep bearing in mind that consumption is passive, production is active, and that production is what can lead them towards more engagement, more interest, more positive and productive behaviors, just like project-based learning. And I think what you're talking about is what I just kind of simply call fight fun with fun. You know, if you don't want your kid involved with Pink and Pretty and Barbie all the time, you better find something that's equally fun and equally cool and equally interesting, and more so, and scratches that itch. And that's out there. It just does mean that we as adults, and since I work with younger kids, there's more adult involvement, have to do a little more work to understand and find and help them navigate towards it so that then they can become the producers of the culture.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all.